Hello everybody, I'm Chris Callahan, also known as Mr. C. Today we're going to talk about opening principles. So what is the opening? Well, it's something that is very poorly named, in my opinion. You see, we divide a chess game into three phases. The end of a long game, when very few pieces are left, is called the end game. The middle part of the game is called the mid game. And the beginning part of the game is called the opening. It should be called the beginning game, right? Yeah, well, I wasn't around when they decided what to call it, so it's called the opening. Anyway, we talk a lot about capturing pieces. Take, so on and so forth. And it makes sense to talk a lot about captures because it's the way that most chess games are probably won. But what do you do if there's nothing to take? What about a position like this? Has anybody ever played this position? You probably have. So there's nothing to take here. What do? I guess we could just choose any old piece and move it, but that can't be right. That doesn't sound like something a good chess player would do. Today I'm going to give you some ideas to help you find moves in the beginning of the game when there's nothing to take and nothing much going on. What I'm going to do is give you a to-do list. Do you know what a to-do list is? It's a little list that you keep to remember the stuff that you're supposed to get done. So at the beginning of the day, you make a little list of what you'd like to do. I don't know. Number 1, take a bath. Number 2, brush my teeth. Number 3, go to the store and buy a zebra. And the reason that you do this is because if you didn't, you would take a bath, and then you would brush your teeth, and then you'd be thinking, I was supposed to buy something. What was it? But if you've got the to-do list, it's easy to remember, and you will get your zebra. What I'm going to do today is to give you a chess to-do list for the beginning of the game. Now, this list is only for the beginning of the game. If things go well, you should have all the things done by move 10 or 15 at the latest, and at that point, you're on your own. But if you get everything done in a reasonable amount of time, you should have at least an okay position. And I really hope you will remember that this to-do list is just a tool. It's things that you want to get done, but you can't necessarily do one on every move. Chess is complicated. There's always other things going on that you have to consider. Like, for example, if you have checkmate, just forget about the list and play checkmate. You win. That's it. That's all that matters. Another example, if you're about to get checkmated yourself, again, forget about the list for just one move. Do something to not get checkmated, and then we can start thinking about the list again on the move after. So let's get started. Number 1 on the to-do list is put a pawn in the center. I'm not going to get too much into exactly why it's so important to put a pawn in the center. Basically, your pieces won't have space to get into the game if you don't. The first thing we have to talk about is what is the center. Well, these squares here are the center, the real center. And these squares here are not quite the center, but still pretty center. This is the area that you need to have a pawn in. Let me give you an example. In the history of chess, which is, of course, very long, the most popular first move for white, the one that most people play, is pawn to e4. The second most popular move after pawn to e4 is pawn to d4. What about black? Well, after white plays pawn to e4, in the entire history of chess, the most popular move, the one that most black players play, is pawn to e5. Are you noticing any similarities? Are you noticing any themes here? Yes, they're all putting pawns in the center, right? And they're usually on the first move of the game. So what I recommend to you is on the very first move of the game, if you're playing white or black, put a pawn in the center. There are other good moves, and you can see other very good players playing other good moves, but I am not recommending you play any of those moves. I am recommending you put a pawn in the center so that you don't forget to do it. If you put it off for later, you'll forget to do it, and you can't forget to do something that you've already done. So just put a pawn in the center on the very first move and get it out of the way. Number 2 on the list, knights and bishops first. This one takes a little explaining. So let's take a look at this bishop on c4, and let's compare it to this bishop on c1. Which bishop would you say is happier? Which one is doing better? Clearly, it's the bishop on c4. Bishops, like most pieces, like to have lots of squares to move to, and this bishop on c4 is happy as a clam. He has so many squares to move to. What about the bishop on c1? How many different squares can he move to? Count them up. I'll give you a second to think. Pause your videos if you like. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, the bishop has nowhere to go. He's totally stuck. 0 possible squares to move to. He is totally miserable. Do you notice how at the beginning of the game, almost all of the pieces are trapped back here on the back row with nowhere to go? And of course, they don't like that. Even the knights only, they can jump, but they only have a couple spaces to go, which isn't very good, isn't very impressive. So we need to get our pieces from the back row where they're miserable in towards the middle where they're much happier. Doing this, by the way, is called development. It's not incredibly important that you remember that word, as long as you remember to get your pieces out. So the pieces want to get out, but the order they come out in matters a lot. If the knights and bishops come first, like I said, that means that rooks and queens and kings and pawns, that's all the chess pieces, right? Yep, that's all of them. Those guys don't come in first. So why do the knights and bishops come in first and everybody else doesn't? Well, let's talk about these pieces one at a time. What's wrong with the queen coming out early? Well, there's a chess opening called the Scandinavian defense. It's fairly popular, not hugely popular. And the one big disadvantage to this move, pawn d5, is that when white takes this pawn, if black doesn't want to be down a pawn, we have to take back with the queen. And this, of course, brings the queen into the game early. Now, white usually plays knight c3 here, which gets a piece into the game and attacks the queen at the same time. And, of course, black saves their queen. And a very popular move here, which might surprise you, is queen d8, right? If we're trying to get our pieces in the game, why are we putting one back? Well, strong players know that having a queen in the game early isn't necessarily so great, so a lot of them will just fix it by putting the queen back. But what if you tried to keep your queen in the game, right? You think, I got a piece in the game, I want to keep it in the game. So let's play queen g5. Well, white might play a move like knight f3, attacking the queen. And it's black's turn, and black would love to get a piece in the game, but he can't. We have to save our queen. The queen is the strongest chess piece. We really can't let them just take our queen. So I'll play queen h6, saving the queen, and then pawn d4, attacking the queen again. So I'll save my queen, and then bishop g5, attacking the queen again. I can't notice that I can't take this because I'll lose my queen. So I'll put it here, and then bishop b5, attacking the queen again. And actually, I can't move it out of the way because I'll lose my king if I do. So that's not a legal move. Now look at the board. Look what's happened. Who is further along in their to-do list? Who has gotten more done? Well, white has a pawn in the center. White has all 4 knights and bishops in the game. What about black? No knights and bishops. The only piece in the game is the one that we don't want in the game yet and that we're about to lose. How did this happen? Well, it happened because white spent all their moves getting pieces in the game, and black spent all their moves running around with their queen. They played a bunch of queen moves in a row, and they kind of had to, because otherwise they lose their queen. The solution to that is not to let them take your queen. The solution is to not bring your queen into the middle of the board where it gets chased around. This is why bringing the queen into the game early is usually not so great. So what about rooks? Why don't rooks get to come into the game early? Well, one move that beginners often play is pawn to h4. And the idea behind this move is clearly to bring the rook into the game and then slide over and start going to do stuff. And it's a good idea. It's a fantastic idea. You have good intentions. The problem is it just doesn't work. What will happen is that black will play a move like pawn to d5. And now what happens if you continue with the plan? Crunch. Oops. Now you can take back, so it's not a free piece, but rooks are stronger than bishops, so that's a nice bit of business for black. This idea might work out in other positions. For example, what about a position like this? Does h4 make sense here? Well, yeah, now it's not so crazy because after the rook comes in, this bishop isn't attacking it anymore, so maybe you can make it work. Sometimes this stuff with h4 or pawn to a4 on the other side works, but it just doesn't work at the beginning of the game. What about pawns? Why don't pawns like to get into the game? Well, pawns are very strange. They're very different from the other pieces. Do you remember we were talking about bishops, and I said this bishop right here was so happy and it had so many squares to move to, and then I talked about this other bishop, which was miserable and it can't go anywhere? Well, pawns don't really work like that. Let's try the same thing with pawns and see what happens. Here's a pawn right here. How many different squares can that pawn go to? Hasn't moved yet. It can go to 2. It can go 1 square up or 2 squares up. It's not a lot, but you know, it's a pawn. We don't expect much. Now let's move it into the game and see what happens. Now how many squares can it go to? Well, now it's only 1. It has less squares now after we moved it into the game. So what we learn from that is that we probably don't want to move a lot of pawns because they don't care. It doesn't help them. Now, we do have to move some pawns because otherwise the bishops can't get into the game, the queen can't get into the game, and so on and so forth. But when we move them, we're not really moving the pawn to help the pawn. We're moving it to get out of the way of other pieces. We're also putting a pawn in the center, as you may recall from earlier in the video. So that brings us to the king. What should we do with our king? Well, the king doesn't want to go to the middle of the board. He doesn't want to have lots of squares to move to. He doesn't care about any of that. He just wants to be safe. And that's probably why we get a special move that helps to keep him safe. Of course, I'm talking about what is number 3 on our list, castling. You need to get castled and get your king safe. You move the king over towards the rook. The rook jumps to the other side. You can also go the other way. And it's very important to have your king safe. Good chess players, I would say, castle in 9 out of 10 games they play, and they usually do it in the first 5 or 10 moves. Okay, and if you want to be a very good chess player, you will have to do the same thing. Okay, so let's practice this stuff. I'm going to give you a chess position, and your job is to find a good move. Not necessarily the very best move. There will be more than one good move in some of these positions, but just a reasonable move. So this is our first position. You're playing white. I'll give you a second to think. Pause your videos if you like. Well, this is one of those positions with lots of very reasonable moves. First of all, we always look for stuff to take and make sure we're not getting checkmated and all that. And there's actually nothing that even white can think about taking, so that's pretty easy. So let's get a piece in. You could put your bishop on c4. You could put your bishop on b5. That would also be reasonable. You could move your pawn up to d3 to let your bishop in. You could move your pawn up to d4 to let your bishop in. You could play pawn to b3 to let your bishop in. Pawn to b4 probably isn't so great because that's a free pawn. You could play a move like g3 to let your bishop in, but of course this bishop already has a way in, so it seems like you're kind of wasting time. But g3 isn't totally crazy. Let's move on to the next position. All right, same thing here. You're playing white. What is the best move? I'll give you a second to think. Pause your videos if you like. Well, this one is slightly a trick question because I've just been talking for a long time about getting your pieces out, and the answer is not getting your pieces out. If you played a move that got a piece out somewhere, you probably played something reasonable, and it's not a disaster to do that, but you have an opportunity here that may not be available on the next move, and you really need to take it. There is a totally free knight on h6. And when something like that comes along, you put your to-do list away for just a moment, you take up that free knight, and then you continue with the to-do list on the next move. Okay, here's another one. We're playing white. What would you do? I'll give you a moment to think. Pause your videos if you like. Well, let's look at the captures. Before we do anything, there are 2 captures. We could take the pawn here, but it doesn't look so good to me. We're giving up a bishop for a pawn. The king is a little bit exposed, but I don't think we're going to checkmate him. He would be able to defend. The other capture is taking this pawn here, and that one is just a trade. Black would take back with the knight or the pawn, and we traded a pawn for a pawn. Nothing much happening there. Personally, I would get a piece in. I would play knight c3. I would play bishop e3. I would castle if I could. Here's a question. I would not play knight a3. Why do you think that I am not such a fan of knight a3? Well, it's because knights usually like to go towards the middle. I'm not going to tell you to always put them right here or right here, but knights have a lot less squares to move to when they're on the edge. So if I put this knight on c3, you'll see that it has a lot of squares that it's aiming at. It's really a much better piece than if I put it on a3, because when I put it on a3, it's kind of trapped in on the side of the board. Can't do much over there. So make sure your knights go in the center. Okay, last one. You were playing white. What would you do? I'll give you a second to think. Pause your videos if you like. Well, there's one very important thing going on in this position that you really must notice in order to find a good move, and that is that your queen is in danger. If you played any move that didn't save your queen, I'm very sorry, you played a bad move. You're going to lose your queen. If you got your bishop in, crunch. That's the end of your queen. If you took the bishop, which you may have thought you could do, you also lost your queen. So we do have to save our queen, but there's different ways to save our queen. And we should choose the best one. For example, I could block with the pawn. I could move my queen to d2. Or I could block with the knight on one of a couple squares. In my opinion, clearly the best moves are blocking with the knight. Why is that? Well, because it gets the knight in the game. Sometimes in chess games you have a threat, there's something you have to deal with, but you have different ways to stop it. And if you have a choice between stopping it with a move that gets a piece in or stopping it with a move that doesn't get a piece in, why not get a piece in? Personally here, I would play knight f3. Thank you all for watching. That's all I have. I hope you guys will remember the to-do list and try to get those things done in the first 10 or 15 moves. Goodbye.